Welcome to Life Science. This lesson is on plant reproduction and life cycles. These are the objectives that we're covering throughout the unit. Our goals for today are to be able to identify the parts of the life cycle of plants and to identify the parts of a seed. So we will be going through some review questions in class, so if you want to take the time and prepare yourself for class, or if you are an independent student and want to do the review on your own, you can, and then you can check your answers from the posted recording. Okay, so when we talk about plants, we're talking about the different types of plants: vascular, non-vascular, and seed plants. We also know that there are seedless plants as well. So when we talk about plants, remember that plants have very specific characteristics. All green plants have chlorophyll. That's what gives them their green color. All plants are autotrophs, which means that they make their own food. Almost all plant cells have a cell wall, and we talked about that at the beginning of the year. I had you do a drawing of a plant cell and an animal cell to compare them. Green plants go through photosynthesis, and all plants are multicellular. So here is just a review of a very typical plant cell. We know that a couple of differences between a plant cell and an animal cell include the cell wall. That would also include the chloroplasts. But most of the other organelles within the cell of a plant and an animal cell are just about the same. Another difference would be the starch grain that is in the plant cell and the rafide crystal and the Druze crystal. But we didn't talk about those when we talked about plant cells and animal cells. We looked at the main organelles within each cell. So what I want you to think about, okay, is what is a life cycle? And in class, I'm going to ask you to put up on the whiteboard, what is a life cycle? And then to give me an example to support your answer. So if you want to prepare it a little bit ahead of time, and also independent students, it's good for you to pause the recording here and then write down what your thoughts are about a plant or a life cycle and an example to support that answer. Something else that I want you to think about is, do you think all plants have a similar life cycle? Okay, and I want you to pause the recording and I want you to write down why or why not. And then if you have an example to support your answer. Okay, so when we talk about life cycles, different plants have different life cycles. Okay, a gymnosperm is a plant that produces cones. They're evergreen trees. Okay, and this is an example of a white pine tree and the life cycle for this particular tree. Okay, this particular tree will generate a male cone and a female cone. Okay, and what will need to happen is that the female cone will need to be pollinated. And the way that that happens is that the male cone needs to release the pollen grain from that cone, and then it needs to interact with the female cone in order to fertilize it. Okay, and each type of pine cone does this a little bit differently. Sometimes by soaking the cone, it'll expand and soften that cone, which allows the pollen grain to be released. Sometimes what needs to take place is that these cones, a fire needs to happen in order for the pollens to be released. Okay, so it's just a little bit different for each type of cone. Okay, then what will happen is that, like those little helicopter pieces will form, and then they form what's called a mature fruit, because, and we use that term because seeds are involved. And then what will happen is that the, a protective coating will form to protect those seeds. And then that protective coating also helps to protect and then promote seed dispersal. And then once the seeds are dispersed, then if the conditions are right, then the seeds will fall to the ground, and through wind and water will either begin to grow where they have landed, or sometimes the wind or the water will take them to another location, and then the plant will begin to grow. Angiosperms are plants that produce flowers, and what will happen is that as the plant produces its flower, it will have some different parts inside of it. The stamen is the part that contains the pollen, and the pistil is the area inside the flower where the nectar is, where like bees and other insects and or birds will get their nutrients from. And what will happen is that, and we'll take the bee example, as the bee lands on the flower to get the nectar from the pistil area, the pollen will attach itself to the legs of the bee. The bee will then go to another flower, either on the same plant or on a different plant. So it might go from one apple tree to another apple tree or within the same apple tree, and it will drop the pollen into another flower. And as it drops it into the other flower, the pollen will go down the stigma. Okay, at the stigma, then it'll drop down to the style, to the ovary, to the ovule, and then that's where pollination occurs. And if pollination is successful, then the fruit begins to grow. And it starts off really, really tiny, and then it'll grow, like in this case, to an apple. Inside the apple, there will be seeds. As the apple is dropped to the ground, and then it'll decompose, those seeds will fall into the ground and they will grow. Or water or wind will take those seeds and disperse them somewhere else. Or if an animal eats the fruit and happens to eat the seeds aren't digested, they're expelled through waste, and then if the conditions are right and those seeds go into the ground, then they will begin that process again. Non-vascular plants do not have seeds, okay? Things like mosses, liverworts, ferns, okay? They have spores that grow underneath the fronds, or a moss will grow the sporophyte, where there are these spores that are inside. And then there's a male and the female component. And what'll happen is that the spores will be dispersed, and they usually land in an area close to these plants, and that area is usually fairly wet. It's moist because ferns and mosses and liverworts need water in order to survive. And what'll happen is that the water will carry the male component to the female component, and then through if the female component then is fertilized, it will then go to the ground and reproduce and grow another plant. Okay, but mosses and liverworts need the water to carry those spores so they can connect in order for fertilization to take place. Now, what we'll be doing is that we will be doing a virtual lab in class, and we'll be looking at the life cycle of a simple plant. It's a very short lab, so we'll take a few minutes to do that. And then the second part of the class, we're going to look at our bean seed. And with our bean seed, I'll have you probably soak your bean seed a little bit before class, and I'll send that out in an email so it's a little bit softer and easier to open up. So then after our virtual lab, and I'll put the link into Canvas, we'll be taking a look at a bean seed. Hopefully you have one left. If you don't, then that'll be totally fine. We'll take a look at the bean seed, but you'll follow the procedure as it's outlined on the board. I would encourage independent students that if you have a bean seed left over, that you go ahead and do this. So you can pause the recording here if you're going to do this seed dissection on your own. And then what we'll do is we will observe what's inside and you'll draw it and then you'll label it. So you can pause the recording here and then you can pick up the recording again when you're ready to identify the parts of the bean seed inside. So the parts inside would include the embryo, which is usually towards the top of the bean seed, the cotyledon, and then on the outside is the seed coat, and you would be labeling the parts that you can. Okay, so that would conclude our lesson for the day. Remember that all of your assignments are found in Canvas along with the due dates. If you have questions, make sure that you contact me and see me during study hall or office hours, and have a great day.